A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
A conversation today about loneliness and singleness. Our special guest today is a walking testimony of how the gospel of Jesus empowers us to redeem the deep ache of loneliness. For years, Steve DeWitt was the only never-married 44-year-old mega-church pastor in the United States, and he's living proof that you can be lonely in a crowd. He became known as the Bachelor Pastor. He was surrounded by thousands of people, yet he lived his daily life alone. These days, Steve DeWitt is married to Jennifer for the past 11 years. They have 2 daughters together. Pastor Steve DeWitt has been senior pastor at Bethel Church in Crown Point, Indiana, for 14 years. And now he's released a book in which he shares a unique perspective on solitude and aloneness. It's called Loneliness, Don't Hate It or Waste It, Redeem It. Pastor Steve DeWitt, a special welcome along to 2020.
Neil, I am delighted to be on this call with you. I mean that. I have never been to Australia, but everything I know about it makes me want to come. And so it's a delight, at least digitally, to come to Australia and to talk about my story with you.
Let's start with that part of your story, which I'm sure you probably get asked about a fair bit. Are some people suspicious of a single pastor, particularly pastor of a mega church? You might even like to describe your church too there, but this suspicion that people have when you're a single person.
Well, I would say it really depends on, whose perspective, who we're talking about. Some people embraced it. Some people thought it was odd. In fact, I remember I was at a lunch party and this 8-year-old girl noticed I wasn't wearing a wedding ring and asked her mom rather loudly, "Is he married?" And she said, "No, he's single." And she said loud for the whole party to hear, "That's odd." And I would say that's not a bad summary of most people. It was odd. And it depends on, the culture of the world that you're talking about. I've been in places of the world that would not allow a single man to be a pastor. And they have looked at me with some, surprise to find that. Other places, it's just a little unusual. And mostly in the U.S., I would say it's more on the unusual side. But yeah, so my quick summary story would be that I went into ministry. I was fully intending on getting married and having, the traditional family. But it just didn't happen. And over the course of my ministry career, 27 years ago, I came to Bethel Church near Chicago, and in God's providence, he grew the church into a very large church. And all that while, I just, I was the single senior pastor, and people would come to visit and they'd be like, "Yo, hey, where's your wife?" And I'd say, "Well, I'm single," and they would just look at me like, in shock at the possibility of it. I got a kick out of it most of the time. So I was single until I was 44, and then I met my wife Jennifer, and we got married. We got pregnant right away, and so now I have a beautiful 11-year-old and a beautiful 9-year-old daughter, and they're a great joy to me. But I've been on both sides of it, and the book is not about lonely single people get married and then the loneliness goes away. It's a book about loneliness. It's just that my context was a couple decades of adult aloneness, some 8,000 nights I calculated, which is a long time for a pastor theologian type, Neil, to think about, why do I feel the way that I do? And so I've written out of my experience and hopefully biblically faithfully to explain the biblical answers to chronic loneliness.
Over the years, Steve, on this program and on this station, some have said, well, because you're the Christian station, you do a lot on marriage. We want to encourage marriage and good, wholesome solid, lifelong commitment in marriage. And there's been over the years people who've said, well, hey, what if you do some stuff on singleness? And so singleness, one of those things, a lot of single people live with the hope that they will one day meet Mr. or Miss Right, and that somehow or other that's going to eliminate this ache of loneliness that they might have in their hearts. Any thoughts here around singleness, and is marriage the answer that single people are seeking to eliminate that ache of loneliness?
I would say a qualified maybe. Loneliness, there's a difference between aloneness, which is neutral, loneliness that is undesirable, and solitude, which is actually positive. To be single, generally speaking, is to be alone. And marriage does solve the aloneness problem, if aloneness is a problem. In fact, we see that in Genesis 1 and 2. Many people mistakenly think that Adam was lonely. It doesn't say that he was lonely. In fact, I think he was completely fulfilled in his relationship with God. It does say that he was alone. And God said, it's not good that Adam is alone. And so they created Eve. So Eve was the solution to aloneness, not loneliness. Loneliness doesn't appear until Genesis 3, when sin enters into the cosmos. And right away, there is alienation between Adam and God and Adam and Eve. They feel naked. They feel shame. There is the initial feeling that someone or something is missing that I was made for. And so I think when you apply that then to marriage and singleness, if somebody is profoundly lonely as a single person, they probably will be lonely as a married person, because loneliness is not fixed by marriage. You can be lonely in a crowd. You can be lonely in marriage. In fact, I would argue marital loneliness might be the worst kind of loneliness, second only to maybe losing a beloved spouse. So I would urge the singles not to view marriage as the solution to their loneliness. It does solve aloneness, and it can help with loneliness in the ways that sacrificing and loving and being inconvenienced for somebody also helps with loneliness. And marriage puts you in a context where every single day there is that opportunity.
Do you think for people who are going through struggles in their marriage and they're feeling alone, this thought of a woman who says, oh, my husband checked out years ago, I've been lonely, he doesn't communicate. A man might have the same perspective about his wife. She checked out, she's not interested in me. Do you think that loneliness might even be one of those dimensions that if you're looking to strengthen and nurture and enrich your marriage, maybe this is something to deal with? Because I think we're getting to it, but there's a spiritual dimension that helps to alleviate that loneliness. But what are your thoughts here for married people who are saying, well, I'm not single, but I'm still feeling lonely?
Well, there's a famous pastor in America named D. James Kennedy, and he somewhat jokingly said that 90% of his counseling was singles who wanted to get married and married who wanted to be single again. And, it's a little tongue in cheek, but there's truth to that, where if you view your marriage as the solution to your lonely heart, you're going to find marriage to be a very difficult place for that to happen. It is not being married. It's not being in proximity. It's not having somebody in your life. It is sacrificing for someone in your life that mitigates loneliness. And marriage provides, along with parenting. I mean, parenting is another incredible personal sacrifice every day that provides an opportunity to give of yourself to meet the needs of somebody else. And that's really what I'm saying in the book is the key to redeeming loneliness, is to let loneliness spur us towards the kinds of life and sacrificial self-giving that God designed for us to live and flourish. And by giving of ourselves to others, that love of God through us mitigates the loneliness in us. And that's true whether you're single or whether you're married. And in marriage, I think the challenge, just to add this quick thought, the challenge is that this person that you are sleeping next to, living every day with, is also a sinner, and the dynamics there ebb and flow in positive, sometimes negative times, and it can add to the loneliness if that relationship is not nurtured. And so marriage is its own cauldron of challenge. But those are some thoughts for you.
When you were single, the bachelor pastor, and you began to think through these issues, and maybe you had aspirations yourself that one day you'd be married, but you were going through this time, and for decades, sensing this loneliness. Those sorts of emotions you're on a roller coaster. You like to talk about hearing our emotions properly. Sometimes our emotions are controlling us. I guess there must be some ways that we can take control of the emotions. What are your thoughts here?
Do you mean in the question, how do we wrestle with the feelings of loneliness?
Well, when did you first recognize that you could be lonely and you could be depressed by that, or that there must be a higher aspiration so that, dealing with that emotion rather than letting the emotional state deal with you? Sure.
Well, as the title says, don't hate it or waste it, redeem it. I think much of my journey was me hating and resenting and thereby wasting loneliness. And it wasn't until I began to really think through why I feel this way, and biblically, from a Christian worldview, what is the explanation for loneliness? Why do we feel this, and what are we supposed to do with it? Which I would say was probably in my 30s somewhere, where I, as I got older and as my the valleys of loneliness maybe got deeper, I was somewhat forced to be contemplative about these very painful feelings. And as a pastor, I sought answers, in the Bible and from godly counsel. And I began to formulate a worldview about loneliness and began to do something about it. One of the things that, as I talk about loneliness, if you're listening right now, I want you to know I have profound sympathy and compassion for the feelings of loneliness. They can eat you alive. I know that. But one of the things that I'm urging is we are not victims of loneliness. Loneliness is a gift. And in my story, once I turned the corner and realized that loneliness is a gift from God, it's a part of common grace. Believers and unbelievers all feel loneliness. And God gave it as a gift to spur us towards those relationships and actions within those relationships that He designed in our image bearing to bring meaning and fulfillment to our life. So I compare it to like hunger or thirst, which we don't like to feel hungry. We don't like to feel thirsty. But when we feel hungry, we want to do something about it. It spurs us to eat. And loneliness is like that. And this is how it's a gift. It spurs us towards those relationships and sacrificial actions within those relationships that by design, when God, the triune God, engineered us, He made us to find fulfillment from. So loneliness isn't the presence of something, it is the absence of something. And redeeming it is bringing what God intended into our experience and to have the flourishing that He intended for us.
Steve, before we take any more calls, just touch on that. Your church is called Bethel Church. There's another church that's quite well known called Bethel Church, and some think it's a little controversial too. But you're not connected to them at all.
We are not. In fact, I think our church was named Bethel prior to them, maybe even starting. But there are thousands of churches named Bethel in the U.S., and it's a very, very common name.
Okay, so 1-800-316-316 for listeners to join into our conversation. Let's take another call as we get this segment underway. Dave is in Melbourne. Hello, Dave. Welcome along.
G'day, guys, and thanks for sharing, Steve, your story. It's very interesting to hear your journey. My question is less about being single or married and loneliness, but you mentioned, that we need to see loneliness as a gift from God, and that's very interesting because it's both an epic, where you're basically kind of calling it, because it's kind of an epidemic at the same time. So to see it as an epidemic, which it is, but also a gift from God to, I think you said something like to spur us on. I guess my question is if you can give some practical tips for people who have been disabled by loneliness in this epidemic, who, for those of us who have heard this idea that we could see it as a gift rather than a problem, how can those who want to be able to use it as a gift to spur us on and to encourage others, how can we go from being disabled by the loneliness that we've experienced to wanting and desiring to want to...
Dave, you're making some great points here. And when you talk about being disabled in an epidemic of loneliness, what are some practical things that you can do? And we'd love to get into practical things, especially in this time of a conversation like this. So when we're talking practical things, where do we start with practical things, Steve?
Well, Dave, thank you for the call. I would say that loneliness by itself is a gift. Loneliness weaponizes in us, and weaponized loneliness is a problem. Just like hunger is a part of a healthy human body, famine is a major world problem, and loneliness is similar to that. And what I'm urging is to see the existence of loneliness as a gift built into our inner architecture by a God who lovingly put these impulses in us to ensure that humanity would move towards one another, and most importantly, to move towards Him. So to get practical, I think that was the question Dave asked. I begin by the vertical dimension. This is the most important one because it's the eternal one. The loneliness that human image bearers have primarily is a theological one. We feel naked before God, and we long for Him. That nakedness is not a lack of clothing, it is a lack of righteousness, which Jesus came to fulfill, and to understand that part of Jesus' purpose in coming certainly is to reconcile us to our Creator. This comes by faith in Jesus Christ and a turning to Him, believing in Him, following Him, becoming a Christian. This reconciles the vertical dimension, which is the most important one. And I would urge anyone listening to right now put your faith in Christ and believe in Him. Most people, though, I think, observe loneliness in the horizontal. And here is where I think the gospel as well is part of the solution. I talk about you got to gospelize your loneliness. What do I mean by that? Well, by the gospel, we are reconciled to God. From the gospel, we are called to this kind of death to self. Like with the gospel, we are blessed by giving of ourselves, following the example of Jesus, who, Philippians 2, emptied himself, gave all that he had in an act of love, ultimate love. And so gospelizing our loneliness is the opposite of what our instincts urge upon us. You know, when we think about when we're lonely, we think, who do I need in my life to fill this void? You know, I need somebody to meet my needs. No. Overcoming loneliness has little to do with gaining somebody. We have to lose somebody, and that somebody is us. It is taking up our cross, following Jesus, following in the way, and following his example of giving and serving others. So my big point, or one of my big points, is that we have to give our loneliness away. And Dave and Neil, what I mean by this is, as we orient our loneliness towards meeting the needs of other people's loneliness, and as we orient ourselves towards sacrificing for others, it is the love of God through us that mitigates the loneliness in us. And the more that we give of ourselves to others, the more our own personal loneliness moves into the background of our emotional experience. And this is kind of I'm inverting what people naturally want to do. I'm turning it upside down. It's gaining by losing, but it's losing me as I seek to bless others. So one final thought here. It's not having someone in your life. It's sacrificing for someone in your life. This is why, as a maybe silly example, but people oftentimes find pets help them. What's a pet? A pet is another being that you have to think about and be inconvenienced for and pay the medical bill for and worry about their food and, leave parties early so you can take the dog out. And, all of those inconveniences help because I'm having to get out of myself and live for someone else. And in that way, it is that self-giving life that Christianity calls us to that also mitigates the power of loneliness in our life.
Dave, in Melbourne, anything further to add?
I mean, that's some big stuff right there. That you could sit with that for a long time. But at some point, you've got to really just bite the bullet and die to self. That's ultimately what he's saying, and it's not something that you want to hear in a way that, when you are maybe trying to find a way to get out of the hole of loneliness, but it's an important truth that I think we all know in our minds that at the back there. But I think it's just a good reminder.
Dave, thank you so much for your call. Our talkback line is open on 1-800-316 316. Interesting the way Dave says something we sort of know in our mind is there. Come back to the theological side, because we like to tie in our faith to how we might be able to approach these things even in a practical way. You say that, you feel lonely because you were made for God. So if you're out on the edge and God is not even in your thinking around your loneliness, maybe you're missing something here because, as you said, it's like God, drawing you to himself. Any thoughts here around being made, you mentioned, in God's image and how God might use that loneliness to draw you to himself?
Absolutely. I think when I say that loneliness is a gift, it really is rooted in the character of God. To understand loneliness, you must understand the nature of God. And Christian teaching is that God is one and God is three. He is a diversity in unity. He is the three in one. And within the Godhead, God delights in, they delight in one another. They're fully satisfied in one another. Think about all the times Jesus talks about the loving relationship with his Heavenly Father, particularly in the Gospel of John. And so God in his goodness, when he made us in his image, made us to reflect that aspect that he delights in the most in his own being. And so he builds into us this need to be in life-giving relationships with other human beings. And we see then that sin is such a destroyer. And part of what it took away is it took away harmony and full satisfaction in our human relationships with one another. Not entirely, but substantially. And so loneliness is rooted in the character of God. In that way, it is a gift from God, wanting us to experience the joy in one another that God experiences within his own being.
Wonderful illustration to be able to talk about God, one God, three persons. And so he, even in his own self, is is not lonely because there's fellowship within the Trinity. And so when we're created in God's image, created to be in community, and I guess this is where we come to families and a church as being a place of belonging. What are your thoughts about those practical elements of our lives?
Well, I agree with you. Family is such a blessing. Church family, such a blessing. But their existence by itself doesn't solve the problem. It requires a hospitality of the heart that I have for other people, a welcome. You know, as Paul writes to the Romans, accept or welcome one another as Christ has accepted or welcomed you. And that openness of heart, which in a broken world where people betray us and stab us in the back and lie to us, is hard to maintain, even in a local church where oftentimes it's the people that make it the hardest. I'm preaching this weekend on 3 John, and that Diotrephes, man, what a problem he was. And even a healthy church will have problems. Yet Christ loves flawed, broken people like us and calls us to love, to be a friend of sinners as well. And so I urge people to be risky in their friendships, to have your front door open and be ready to welcome people. And sometimes this means being awkward with people. In fact, Jenny Allen wrote a book entitled Find Your People. She basically urges that. Get as awkward as you can, as quick as you can. Invite somebody over to fold your clothes. Don't clean the house. Be real. And quick story. So this is something as a pastor that doesn't come easy necessarily because there's so many people that want to, be friends with you. It's hard to, sort through that. And so one time I met this guy and kind of liked him, and we went out for coffee together. And just over the time of talking, I felt a kinship with him. And when it was all done, I took a deep breath and I took a risk. I said, I've enjoyed this time, and I'm wondering if you'd be willing to have an intentional friendship with me. Now, that was a big gulp for me to say, especially early on. He replied, I feel exactly the same way. And that friendship has become one of the most meaningful friendships in my life. But it required me to get out of my comfort zone a little bit, my self-protection, and to open my heart and say, you know what, I'd like to be a friend with you. And I think more of that would help. And, maybe there's some things, one of the things I counsel is if you have maybe some aspects to your personality that hinder healthy relationships, is there somebody that you trust, that knows you, that loves you, that you could just honestly say, I struggle with loneliness. What do you see in the way I conduct myself that might be hindering the kind of life-giving relationships my heart longs for? And seek to make some of those modifications. A little change could go a long way towards helping those relationships to cultivate. So there's a few thoughts, Neil.
Well, let's take another call. Wayne is in Mackay in Queensland. Hello, Wayne. Welcome along.
Hey, how are you, mate?
Very well. What are your thoughts, Wayne?
Mate, I can relate to the gentleman there saying exactly what he's saying, mate. I come out of a drug addiction. 22 years. I've been clean for over 30 now. And I settled wrong boundaries in my life. I never knew no different. But once I got the Lord in my life, I've been a Christian now for 32 years, and it's been the last 3 years. It's almost like taking God for granted the way it was then compared to now. With that relationship, and I had to do a lot of dealing within myself internally, and had to be serious with it, hold nothing back. And my relationship since then, like working with the homeless, like I do in Mackay, learning to understand people more through this, where God's taken me. And my first priority every day is just to spend that time early in the morning with the Lord, and throughout the day just asking Him and spending time with Him, and just cultivating my relationship not only with Him but also with him helping me to cultivate my relationship with other people as well. And I come out where that man was talking about my relationship with people wasn't good, and I didn't know any different because that's the way I had been for a long time. I guess coming out of the drug addiction and just being treated that way and treating other people the wrong way until the Lord really showed me. And my life has never been the same. I've had encounters with God from 6 to 8 weeks there, like at one stage, and another times there. And I just look so forward to I know God has got it so that he knows we've got things to do during the day, whether it be spending time with their family and other people and doing shopping and whatever it may be. But
Wayne, you're making some great points here. Let's bring our guest in. Thoughts here for Wayne, coming from your side of things here. Steve.
Well, first of all, I love the way he called you mate. I loved hearing that. And Wayne, I would say, is a kind of a paradigm here of a life getting out of itself. He is looking to serve others, especially those that are in need. He's giving his loneliness away. And that's what I think that we have to do. We have to give the love we long for. We want people to love us sacrificially and cherish us. And we can wait a very long time before somebody comes along and does that. Better is to give that love away. And as we give the love we long for, I think that not only does it mitigate the loneliness, but it flourishes the relationships that we're cultivating, which can become deeply meaningful in our life.
Wayne, thank you so much for your call. Time is running short. I can't help but think this is great for people who can get out and about. There are some who are shut-ins and maybe disabled, just growing older, and maybe they're feeling as though they don't have the love of the family or friends the way they used to before. Any special advice for those? I mean, you've got an ageing population in the US. We've got an ageing population here in Australia. Perhaps maybe something for those who might be feeling a little bit reclusive or shut in, not even because of their own issues. Thoughts for those who are dealing with levels of loneliness?
Absolutely. So we look to Jesus, who said, "I'm not lonely. The Father is always with me." And that truth is just as true for us in Christ, that we might be alone, but we're never fully alone. God is with us. And that's true in that nursing home, in that quiet place that you might be. I think also it's important to locate loneliness in the redemptive story. So it begins in Genesis 3. The possibility of it being redeemed comes with Christ. And here we are now in the time of the church, the new age, and to look forward and to realize that loneliness is a temporary reality. For the Christian, someday we will be with God, we will be in glory, we will not have a hint of loneliness, and we will probably look back on these fleeting days on earth and think, I'm so glad that I won't ever feel lonely ever again. So loneliness is a temporary reality. We take hope in the gospel, and we look forward to the day when, for us, there is no loneliness.
Well, Steve, I wish we had a whole lot more time to talk. Time is escaping us, though. Let me point people to how you can connect with Pastor Steve DeWitt. He's been senior pastor at Bethel Church in Crown Point, Indiana, for 27 years, not 14 as I mentioned a little earlier. His book on loneliness is called Loneliness, Don't Hate It or Waste It, Redeem It. My suspicion is there might be a few lonely people listening in who might want to get a hold of that book, and you'll be able to get that at online booksellers. But you can connect with Steve at his website, stevedewitt.org. That's D-E-W-I-T-T, stevedewitt.org. And you've got a blog site too, Steve, called It's All About Him. Any insight, any of the latest blogs you might have been writing about that listeners might be attracted to? What have you been talking about just lately?
Well, I actually would recommend going to thejourney.fm. That is our media ministry and is much more up to date. The sites that you listed, I think, are a little bit in the past, but thejourney.fm would be a great place. And of course, the book on loneliness. And I would be honored to have any part in God's work in anyone's life. And so thank you so much for having me on the show. It's been a delight.
Steve DeWitt, it's been a delight having you on, and great wisdom. And just to encourage listeners, there'll be a podcast of this conversation that you might want to share with a lonely friend, and you'll be able to do that just a little later on this afternoon. Thejourney.fm, and of course get a hold of that book, Loneliness, Don't Hate It or Waste It, Redeem It. Steve DeWitt, thanks so much for taking some time to share your thoughts and your heart with us today on 2020.
Neil, thank you so much.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.